this case is being televised, right?
I am aware that there are cameras.
And so this gets you your 15 minutes of fame.
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative.
Ruled.
So I stand to gain nothing from this. I'm actually putting myself
at
kind
risk
of in the target of TMZ, a very litigious organization, and I'm not seeking any 15 minutes here. Though you're welcome to speculate. I could say the same thing by taking Amber Heard as a client.
Oh shit!
A little argumentative, don't you think?
Oh, hardly. I find that to be purely logical. Thank you.
Now, are you aware that Mr. Depp's attorneys were well aware of the TRO that was going to be presented?
Good evening, people. In as much as you may not have wanted to see anything about the Johnny Depp trial, it was either that or Justin Trudeau. So I figured we'd intro with, it's humorous, it's funny, and set aside whatever it has to do with the Johnny Depp trial, which people think are as a distraction and yada, yada. I say you can learn things from this. And we've learned something very interesting right there. You know, there's the old expression, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Ask stupid questions, you might get smart answers. And it highlights you're not going to be smarter than everybody on earth. And if you want to play these types of games with people who are quick-witted and think on their feet, you go after someone's intentions for no better reason than to try to impugn their intentions. They can come back and go after yours. It was a very, very classic, stupid question. There was no lead up to it. It was just defense is running low on time, but it was a stupid, cheap attack on intention. 15 minutes of fame? And he flipped it right back on her and embarrassed her. And then she says to him, a little argumentative. You just accused him of that. So if he's argumentative, ask stupid questions and occasionally you'll get a smart aleck answer, as Elaine did there. Now, standard intro, just so that, you know, as people trickle in, we've got Tom Woods on tonight. And whenever I hear the word libertarian, I think it was Kurt Mueller from Uncivil Law. It was someone who sensitized me to the fact that there's big L libertarian, or there's small L libertarian, and then there's like part of the libertarian group or, you know, party. And one is a very, you know, sound philosophical view of the world and government's role in it. And the other, I've been told, is quite interesting and eclectic. So I haven't been able to forget that ever since I was familiarized with the Libertarian Party or the Libertarian Annual Convention, which we might touch on. But we have Tom Woods on tonight, a well-known libertarian, author, host of the Tom Woods Show, well over 2,000 episodes. I'm trying to think, if I was doing my homework today, watching some of the older episodes and interviews of Tom Woods. I mean, if anybody listens to Tom Woods and doesn't think he's incredibly intelligent and makes perfect sense pretty much on everything that I've heard thus far, I dare say you're an anti-libertarian. He's got a great radio voice and speaks some good sense. So we've got Tom tonight. I'm going to bring him in. Now, I said I'd do an intro just to let people come in for like 3 or 4 minutes. Oh, yes. Thank you, Nimitz, for reminding me. I got sat down by my boss yesterday and told I have less than a month to get the jab a la corporate. Would you ask Barnes where I can find legal counsel in MA? No Stepan Snick. Is MA Massachusetts? Nimitz, thank you for reminding me. Super chats, people. YouTube takes 30% to super chats. If you don't like that, we are simultaneously streaming on Rumble. Let me just make sure that we're smooth on Rumble. Rumble has the super chat equivalent called Rumble Rant. Are we live on Rumble? We should be. They take 20%. So better for the creator, better for the platform, to support a platform that supports free speech, yada, yada, yada. No medical advice, no legal advice, no election fortification advice, although I suspect we're going to be dabbing our toes into discussing policy surrounding COVID, government, the role of government in our lives. And Tom Woods is who made me a libertarian 11 years ago, C. Warren. Well, without further ado, without further ado, let's bring in the man of the hour, Tom Woods. Tom, how goes the battle, sir?
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks a lot.
Well, okay, so I like to do a little research on every guest, you know, try to find some scandals, try to find some. You have a pretty clean record from what I was able to see. No outrageous scandals, no nothing. But that I know of. Maybe we'll get into them. But for those who don't know who you are, we do the standard elevator pitch. We get into how you got to be who you are, and then some substantive issues for the evening. But elevator pitches to who you are.
All right, I'll give you the 60-second version. Yes, I'm a libertarian. I wasn't always one, but I always knew, at least from my college years, that I knew I wasn't a Marxist. I knew I wasn't a progressive. When I got to the Harvard campus from the little traditional New England town I lived in, it was so scandalous to me that there were literal communist newspapers for sale that I just decided whatever these people are, I want to be the exact opposite. And eventually, after some twists and turns, I wound up in the libertarian world, where I have written a bunch of books, a couple of best-selling books. I have several membership sites where for example, I teach history to people who feel like maybe they didn't get the whole story when they were in high school. I have a PhD from Columbia University, so I do that too. You like what I have to say about politics? Maybe you like what I have to say about the past. And since 2013, I have hosted the Tom Woods Show, which is now up to over 2,100 episodes, which is either a really amazing milestone or a sign of some deranged, I don't know, some mental defect that someone would devote himself to something like that for so long.
And what my wife says, it could be borderline addiction. If what we do, 2,000 episodes is a lot. But I was watching one of your interviews where you say, you do it 5 days a week. It adds up, and it adds up quickly.
Yeah.
So you said you're from New England.
Yeah.
Born and raised?
Born and raised Massachusetts. And, there have been times when I've wanted to move back to Massachusetts. Now, this is pre-COVID. Now I wouldn't trust Massachusetts, but pre-COVID, I've thought about moving back there. And the trouble is, I love my libertarian people so much. I love them dearly. They're wonderful, wonderful people. But some of them can't shut off ever. So they go to the movies and they have to ask themselves, is this a libertarian movie? I just want to enjoy the movie, So likewise, I say, I'm thinking about moving back to Massachusetts. You can't possibly consider that. The regime is terrible. But you know what? I have loved ones and friends there, and I'm familiar with the place, and it brings me joy. If I can't go somewhere that brings me joy because it doesn't make me a pure libertarian, then I guess I don't care about being a pure libertarian.
So you're born and raised. How many kids? What did your parents do? How many generations American are you?
All right, let's see. I personally have 5 daughters, but I am myself am an only child. My parents, my father's deceased, but he was a blue collar worker. He was a forklift operator for 15 years, and he did not finish high school until he got his GED in his 40s. And he was a great inspiration to me because he went to show how possible it is to be an autodidact. He was entirely self-taught because he was so self-conscious because he didn't have that piece of paper. So he would read and learn and study about everything under the sun. And sure, if you talk to him, he would make grammatical mistakes, but he knew stuff. He read and learned. So I deeply respected that, and he helped to form the way I look at the world. And then my mom was also trying to hold things together in a middle-class household by being a waitress for a while, and then in real estate, stuff like that. And the two of them put together a pretty good household for little Woods here, who went on to go from a household where neither parent had gone to college. And then I went off to be educated by the Ivy League, for better or worse.
Now, how were your parents apolitical? Were they politically engaged? What was that like?
My mother was somewhat apolitical. My father was a Republican, but he was kind of like a blue collar Reagan Republican. Like he was never a Democrat, but he had blue collar instincts, but so he wouldn't be an ideological libertarian or anything. But I have a feeling that if he had lived a little longer, I could have convinced him of the whole package. But so I went off to college, kind of like, I don't know, middle of the road Republican, which is like the thing I can't stand the most today. Like I was like a Mitt Romney. I was bad on foreign policy and I was unreliable on domestic policy. But I knew I wasn't, Mike Dukakis. I knew I wasn't Walter Mondale. I had that going for me.
Now, how did you go from being a respectable, moderate Romney-style Republican to a dangerous Michael Malice attendant anarcho-capitalist libertarian?
By the way, you mentioned Michael Malice. Michael Malice, one of my best friends. And in the old days, it used to be people would say to me, I'm so glad you introduced me to Michael Malice. Now it's, hey, I learned about you from Michael Malice. That is not the way the universe is supposed to work, but that's the way things have turned out. But I would say the thing that changed me was going to the Mises Institute for a week in the early 90s. 2 years in a row, I went for a week for their summer program. And I basically came out of that thinking, look, I either believe in something or I don't. And if I believe in it, I'm going to believe in it all down the line consistently. And
Well,
so
you got to
that's where I
explain.
am, that annoying person who is super consistent all the time.
So explain what the Mises Institute is for people who may not know.
The Mises Institute is named after Ludwig von Mises, who was one of the only economists ever to feature in a Batman comic, because that's how badass the guy was. He taught economics in Europe, even through the 1930s. And as a Jew in Europe, that was not a comfortable place to be or an occupation to have, because he was not preaching autarky along the National Socialist model. He was preaching libertarian ism, more or less. He was preaching classical liberalism and free markets, which was not really what the Nazi regime was known for favoring. So he eventually had to flee Europe. His books were confiscated and papers taken. He had to come to the United States in 1940. He spoke some English, but it was not his first language, so he had to have help writing his future books. He came here with no job lined up, eventually got an unpaid position at NYU. But the significant thing is, if you think back to who was in the economics department at NYU in 1968, you can't name a single person. Nope, who knows? But yet Ludwig von Mises is still talked about. His books are read to this day, partly because of the Mises Institute, which is basically teaching economics along the lines that Mises taught it, and which means, in general, sound money, money that's hard for the government to manipulate, international commerce, peace, and of course also frankly a non-empirical, non-mathematical approach to economics. You look at the typical economics journal today, professionally, it's unreadable. I mean, they're writing it so that they can look like physicists, which they have envy of physicists, because physicists have equations, and so we have to have equations too. And all they're doing is adding unnecessary layers of complication to concepts that can be expressed verbally. So you have now a situation where there was a study, maybe it was 15 years ago, asking how many people read the average article in the American Economic Review. And the answer was 2.5. I mean, that's a basket case of a discipline, if that's the case. So the Mises Institute is a refreshing departure from all this, and it's plain spoken economics for the intelligent layman.
Now, what is its relationship to, and can you give any further expansive definition of what is colloquially called the Austrian School of Economics?
Well, the Austrian school is an approach to economics that basically dates back to 1871. Although you can see forerunners, as with any school, but 1871 is when a guy named Carl Menger wrote Principles of Economics. And the central thing about, I mean, if I had to whittle Austrian economics down, it would be the idea that human beings act and have goals, and they use means to reach those goals. We don't need to know their psychology, which a lot of economists get caught up on. We don't need to know why they do what they do. We don't need to know what motivates them. We need to know they're goal-oriented, and that they use means to achieve their ends. And the Austrian school is extremely, it places a lot of emphasis on the consumer. A lot of, like, classical economics wanted to look at the producer, wanted to look at the business firm, wanted to look at costs of production. Costs of production are what explain prices. But the Austrians would say, well, where did, quote, costs of production come from? From heaven? Like, that can't be the ultimate explanation. Then that just leads us to the question, where did they come from? So the Austrians instead start with the acting person and the acting consumer. And they say that the reason that the factors of production, like factories, machinery, equipment, assembly lines, whatever, the reason they have the value they have is that the consumer values the finished product of the thing that they make. If there was a machine that could do nothing but produce cigarettes and suddenly everybody quit smoking, that machine would go to zero in value. Doesn't matter how much time people put into building it. Doesn't matter how much the company spent on it. It's the consumer's valuation of the final product that then trickles up through the production structure and gives those things the prices they have. So it's the opposite of what most people think, but it's correct.
Is the Mises? I was googling it. The Mises Institute. It's not like it is not respected by what consider themselves to be the institutions of the day. The New York Times. Is
Right.
is there a hierarchy with the Mises Institute? Is it viewed as an eclectic libertarian, or is it well established and respected even among what we call, fake news today?
Well, fake news wouldn't much care for it. There's just no question about it. As a matter of fact, the New York Times some years ago came to visit the Mises Institute and try and get some interviews and write something on it. And the chairman, Lou Rockwell, got wind that somebody from the New York Times was in the Mises Institute. He came thundering down the stairs and he ordered the person out. He said, "You're a mouthpiece of the regime and you're not welcome here." Now, that's very different from a lot of free market think tanks. If a New York Times reporter came there, they'd roll out the red carpet. "Oh, we're so delighted to have you here, Mr. Good New York Times reporter, sir." That's not really how we are. So we're not the kind of group that would say, "Let's invite the chairman of the Federal Reserve over for a cocktail party." No. That is not the way we look at it. We're highly critical. We want to abolish an institution like that. So the Mises Institute has fantastic scholars associated with it. There's no doubt about that. But there are a lot of great scholars who are, let's say, disparaged by the powers that be. And yet the story of Jordan Peterson reminds us that if you have a valuable message that helps people to understand the world more clearly, it doesn't matter if you have the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the whole lot of them against you. You can still get your message out there to a people that's hungry for what you have to say.
And what led to your interest? I kind of interrupted your narrative in that regard of what led to your interest to want to be one of those people, to be sort of what I would call a dissident scholar. In other words, a voice that's very well informed, very well educated, very well literate, you might say, but willing to go against the regime, the cathedral, whatever language we use for the institutional establishment of the day.
I came to the conclusion that I just wanted to understand how the world worked. And as I began to study economics, I came to the conclusion that a lot of things that the average person thinks are going to help him are actually making his situation worse. And I hate to see people sabotage themselves. So I wanted to help explain to people, no, don't do this, do that. But also I came to the conclusion, especially from reading history, that the standard narrative, it just leaves out so much or distorts so much. I'll never forget, I was a freshman. It must have been the first 3 weeks of being in college. And I met a guy who has since turned totally mainstream and would never want me mentioning his name, which is just as well because I can't remember his name. But we were freshmen together, and he was asking me as a U.S. historian if I had ever read a book by Paul Johnson called Modern Times, which is a book about the whole world, not just the U.S., but it has some good chapters on the U.S. And I said, no, I haven't. It's a huge book called Modern Times, the world from the 20s to the 80s. And he said, you should read that book because if you read it, you're going to discover that everybody they say was a bad president was a good one, and everybody they say was a good president was a bad one. He says, now, that's not true for all of them. Like some of them really were bad, or sometimes, it doesn't hold universally. But he says that if you read that, you're going to wonder what else has been left out, what other perspective you didn't get a chance to hear. So being the nerd I was, I got this book. Oh, what is it? I've got it around here somewhere. It's like 800 pages. I sat down and read it. I said, well, this person told me. I remember being so youthful and energetic that I would pick up an 800-page book because somebody recommended it. And so I went through and read it, and I thought, wow. And it really is in a way it's a devastating attack on the 20th century, on the collectivism of the 20th century, the economics of the 20th century, the total war, the propaganda, all the sorts of things that we struggle with today. It is a vigorous polemic, basically against a century. It's absolutely fascinating book. And from that point on, I thought, I want to do what this guy did. I want to dig down deep into the sources and come back out with stuff nobody knows, but they need to know.
Education wise, someone had asked, how did you afford Ivy League? But before we even get there, you got a PhD at, you said Harvard?
Undergrad at Harvard and then PhD at Columbia.
So let me ask the crass question then. How did you go through it? How did you afford it?
Well, the answer is for undergrad, believe it or not, Harvard is actually pretty generous with people, and they don't give merit-based scholarships on the grounds that, well, then everybody would deserve a scholarship because we're bringing in the cream of the crop. So instead, it was all need-based. And as I said, I came from a working-class family, and they came up with a package of loans that I paid off in not too long. They weren't particularly burdensome, outright grants, and I worked a little bit, and it wasn't particularly glamorous work. I cleaned toilets for a living, but it was I've since used that in some of my email marketing. I'll say, well, in the old days, I cleaned toilets, and I wished I could be doing that this product teaches or whatever. So all these stories in my life, I always turn to marketing advantage. But that was basically it, that they were generous enough with us that my parents, who used to take an annual trip to Las Vegas, didn't have to stop taking that trip. They could still actually live. They didn't have to eat macaroni and cheese and drink tap water. They were able to actually live fairly comfortably. I don't know if that's still how it is, but that's how it was in my day.
It is in part because of a protest I was part of at Yale. So back when I was at Yale, it was need-based financial aid, as you're describing, need-blind admissions. So they didn't discriminate against you based on how much need you would have to meet the gap between tuition and available family income, as it was then calculated. I was part of a little protest organization that Yale tried to actually change it for the whole Ivy League, and we helped cause some problems for Yale that ultimately led to the Yale not changing, and so the Ivy League didn't change.
Wow, I didn't know that story.
Yeah, it's a fun little side story, but it's a whole. It's as I like to say, it's another story for another day. But in that capacity, so you're one of the people you studied under for your PhD was Alan Brinkley. Is that correct?
Yeah. How did you know that?
I did a little bit of research.
Oh, okay. Well, good job. Yes.
There's Viva research and then Barnes research, so that's the next level. Sorry,
That's
Robert.
good.
Well, I've always been interested in Brinkley. What was that like, and give people a sense of Brinkley's perspective?
Well, some of the older folks listening to us might remember his father, David Brinkley, who was a newsman. And David Brinkley, he was soft-spoken, but he had a dry wit. Alan Brinkley was soft-spoken, and that was about it. That was about it. Now, the thing is, Alan Brinkley is deceased. He died a few years ago. I don't know. I can't remember if it was Lou Gehrig's disease. He had some very, very unfortunate last few years, but he was provost of the university. He was widely published, very respected within the profession, but very, very businesslike. So I remember there was a day when for some reason, a friend and I had decided I didn't have a beard in school. And a friend and I decided that until we finished our oral exams, we weren't going to shave. I forget what the logic behind this was. So I showed up at his office one day looking like hell. And so I felt like I needed to explain to him why. And he replied, well, that isn't really any of my concern. Okay, strictly business. But what I liked about him was, even though I could predict every word that was going to come out of that guy's mouth, I mean, he was basically a Hillary Clinton Democrat. At the same time, he was extremely professional. He directed my dissertation so skillfully, even though he was completely out of sympathy with me ideologically. He respected me as an up-and-coming scholar, and he did such a good job directing it that several years after I finished the program, my dissertation, I turned it into a book called "The Church Confronts Modernity," and it was published by Columbia University Press, which is no small feather in my cap. So that's another thing I don't know about, not having been on campuses for 20 years. How many professors like that are there who have their ideological commitments, but they love their field and they're committed to their craft, and they'll work with a young scholar even if they feel out of sympathy with them? I don't know, but that was the good fortune I had when I was there.
What
Because
was your
fascinating
dissertation on?
I think I read his book on Father Coughlin and Huey Long.
Yes, right. I
He
did
had
too.
an interest in curiosity and populism, which I think today, like, I don't know if you could cover Father Coughlin, or you would be
Good point.
like, what are you doing covering that person associated with this group and that group? And Coughlin obviously kind of fell off the
Yeah.
res a little bit there at the end, but was an interesting populist figure before then. So yeah, so I've always had interest in Brinkley as to why someone like him could have that sort of discernment, and because his father was known for being both an iconic journalistic figure, but also maybe a little bit of a prick. Whereas Alan Brinkley, at least in the academic community I knew, he did not have that reputation. He was much
No, as a
more.
matter of fact, I think they put together a book of essays by some of his students after he died, and it was just everybody praising him for being a good guy. What's interesting though was he was the most right-wing member of the Columbia History Department. Being a Hillary Clinton Democrat, he was by far the most right-wing figure. And I'm not saying that to be funny. There's no doubt about it. There were at that time, Columbia really specialized in labor history, which I had zero interest in. Even though my own father was a Teamster, I felt like I've lived through enough labor history. I don't need any more. But there were a lot of Marxists doing that kind of stuff. And he was not a Marxist. And so in his classes, he would talk about the atrocities of the Soviet regime. Now, some Marxists, it's true, will say, well, the Soviet Union wasn't real communism. Like, we've all heard that. But they didn't all talk that way. Some of them did speak with some affection about the Soviet Union, even into the 1980s. And so there was actually a brief campaign at Columbia where some left-wing group put up posters all over the campus condemning Brinkley for his right-wing deviationism because he was so critical of Stalin. And I remember him telling me in one of his rare moments of humor, saying, I just never pictured myself being attacked for being too right-wing, but here we are.
Well, this brings me back to a question that I've asked a bunch of people who consider themselves left-wing, despite being rejected or demonized by the left. One person just asked, how did history become so dominated by the left-wing, not revisionist, but rather writing of history? I mean, it's growing up, I remember people speaking highly of the Soviets. They fought the Nazis. They lost millions of men fighting the Nazis. But for communist Russia, we would not have, won the war necessarily against Hitler. And then you go ahead and whitewash all of the atrocities of the Soviets. How did history get so written by what you can call leftist ideology?
I wish I had the answer to this, because it would unlock a lot of other questions, which is, to me, it looks like almost every institution and practically every discipline is in some way dominated by the left. Like even today, the most populist churches, I think, are just all left wing down the line. I mean, I'm a Catholic, and that's just almost just, yeah, you'll see the odd parish priest who might be a non-leftist, but he's persecuted by his bishop. And if there's one sentence of Latin in his mass, he's never heard from again. He's in a gulag somewhere. And this seems to be throughout certainly the mainline churches. Everybody's struggling against some left-wing seminary or whatever. And so it just seems like it's the corporate CEOs all think the same way. The education establishment all thinks the same way. I guess maybe it's the long march through the institutions. They took that seriously, whereas I think people who are non-leftists, I think they just don't organize their lives that way. I don't think they organize their lives thinking, I have to devote my life to the cause, and that means I have to go into this field or write this book or do whatever. I think it tends to be, you tend to be more likely to go into business or some other field. But I don't know. I think it's a failure of people on the political right to not have worked harder, frankly. I mean, today it's impossible to crack in. They're not going to hire you. Forget it. When I used to attend these symposia put on by something called Liberty Fund. Liberty Fund publishes inexpensive editions of classical liberal works. So it could be the works of Adam Smith or John Stuart Mill or something. But they also put on these not advertised colloquia for scholars. It'll be 15 scholars in a room, and everybody's been given some book to read, and then there's a discussion leader, and you discuss this book for a few days at a fancy hotel, and you eat fancy meals, and then you go home and nothing comes out of it. Now, if it were me, a book would come out of that. Like, we would produce something out of these, but it doesn't matter. I got to go to these because the fund had a couple of $100 million they didn't know what to do with, so they would put on these things. And as time went on, instead of these being forums where libertarians and maybe some conservatives could get together and really learn from each other, they began to think, well, let's open it up to people on the left. Let's bring some people on the left and we'll have some really vigorous discussion. Now, there's nothing in principle wrong with that. But my point is, if a left-wing group had a couple $100 million, they wouldn't sit there thinking, we're not really being true to our mission if we don't invite some dissident voices into this conversation. That thought would never dawn on them. And so I think that is what's going on. There's an imbalance in the way the two sides look at the world. If you look at a typical history department, they all think the same way. Whereas typically if you have a group of people like me, half of them will say, well, we really should bring in a few other voices with a few different perspectives. Now, in a way, that's great. In a way, that shows how broad-minded they are. But if one side feels guilty about presenting their perspective and the other side views it as their life's mission, how do you think the composition of academia is going to shake out over time?
Yeah, it's the gap between a freedom mindset versus a totalitarian mindset. The totalitarian, it was like where I became inclined. I tell people that I'm a constitutional populist with anarchistic tendencies. And it was part of a governor's school project when I was a kid in Tennessee. We had an old populist kind of Democratic governor back when those existed on the Democratic Party side. The guy was named Ned Ray McWhirter, grew up the son of a sharecropper, all that. He created a governor's school program for basically any kids in public schools or private schools to go to these special summer projects where you would learn, whether it was, for the arts, for history, for international studies, whatever. But they did a bunch of great projects that summer. It was like some sort of dissident institution that sort of snuck in through the rest. And one of it was they put us in a room, 100 people, and I think they were teaching us about currency, but it was really about power in the state. And basically, it was the first time I realized that I was like, okay, what the state really is a private is a monopoly on the means of certain forms of violence and a means on the legal right of violence. And what's the likelihood that, we're going to pick 4 people in this group of 100 to have that exclusive means and monopoly. What's the likelihood those 4 people are the best 4 people to have that power in the room?
Right.
Chances are it's going to be, especially the ones that are going to be successful seeking it out. I call it the Alex Jones revelation. The people who successfully seek power are not the people you ever want to see have power. And it becomes the problem of power in law school. That's how it's taught in contracts and things like that. How rational self-interest isn't always protected because the problem of power can contaminate someone. Someone can do something against their economic self-interest in the name of power because that's the contaminating effect of power.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So in that context, like you explained sort of your general trajectory intellectually, where did the interest in or disapproval of the concentration of power in the state, this totalitarian mindset we see reflected in the academy and who's allowed in and who's not allowed in, but it's infecting so many of our institutions in the contemporary age. As sort of the Gramsci walk through the institutions, we're seeing this totalitarian mindset and things like everything from comics to theater to, Marvel's going to make a new movie that's the new Thor movie, and it's basically the female Thor movie, and it's not even a good female Thor movie, that kind of routine. What led to a deeper skepticism of the state as an institution that we should always kind of be aware and cognizant of?
Well, first of all, I would say that when I was in school, which was 1990 to 94, things were bad, but they weren't as bad as they are now. There was a huge bias, but not nearly as bad as today. We still struggled to get dissident voices on campus, but we never had the sense that they wanted to murder us, where sometimes you're not so sure today. So I think today it's much, much worse. If you think about somebody like, again, Walter Mondale, absolutely inoffensive presidential candidate, which was his undoing. He was such a bore in 1984. Who was going to vote for that guy? But, that guy was not. He was saying we need to raise taxes a little more than Reagan wants to raise them. He was saying Reagan secretly wants to raise them. I'm going to raise them too. That was his campaign message. I'm going to raise taxes. So is he, but he's not going to tell you. That was not a very good campaign message. But notice his campaign message was not, I can't stand the sight of most of the people in this country, and I'm going to ram down your throat the idea that you are a terrible person and you need to modify the way you look at the world before you'll be admitted to polite society. Nobody was thinking like that. So it was slower for me to get going because things weren't as bad in those days. But in terms of the concentration of power, well, again, honestly, the reading that I started to do on my own, you have to be an autodidact in this day and age. If you're just going to stick with what's on the syllabus, forget about it. You'll get the establishment view, which is useful to know, but you're not going to get beyond that. But reading Paul Johnson's book, my gosh, that is the central lesson of the 20th century. Was you look at the various totalitarian regimes, what did they do? They basically took ideas that had existed in germ in Western political thought for a long time and turned them up to 11. Because if you look back to Thomas Hobbes's sovereign is authoritarian, but not totalitarian. But nevertheless, that sovereign is a force that precedes everything. There's no pre-existing cities or states that have liberties of their own that the sovereign has to respect. The sovereign grants those liberties. And if he wants to take them back, he can take them back. Now, that's the opposite of the American system. But that idea that, in medieval Europe, it was just the opposite. Universities had rights of their own. Cities had rights of their own. The church had rights of their own. Of course, the aristocracy had rights. All these different layers of society had rights. And that's why when you look at the titles that some of these kings had, like you see the comical version in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. He's king of the Britons, and he's defender of this and the savior of that. These long titles were not an indication of vanity on the part of the king, but they indicated that the king is part of a web of relationships, pre-existing relationships that came before him. And it's his job to protect and nurture the liberties of these smaller groups. Today, we've taken the Hobbesian logic and taken it to its logical conclusion where there are no such relationships, that the sovereign can't just overturn, cancel, modify, penalize. And so now that has been carried through. I mean, of course, we see it in the United States quite a bit in the overriding of federalism, in there being a central government policy on all kinds of issues under the sun. Now, we've seen the states and the smaller institutions beginning to reassert themselves in the age of COVID and beginning to reassert themselves because of the woke stuff. But that's the phenomenon that I saw taking place, was this idea that instead of the sovereign being there as the protector of pre-existing liberties, the sovereign is the generous grantor of liberties that can be canceled at any time. Well, then you wind up with a society like we have now.
Funny time for this question, and I'm starring a lot of the super chats, which Tom I'll try to get to if I can afterwards. What's the difference between authoritarian and totalitarian between both of you?
The ruler can be quite brutal in making sure that there are no breakaway provinces, or that there are no groupings of people trying to assert rights against the center. But the authoritarian doesn't care what you think. He doesn't care what you eat. He doesn't care about your lifestyle. So that's kind of like, you can find a number of dictators in the world today who, as long as you stay out of politics, they're not going to bother you. They're not going to look into what your private emails say, or what books you're reading, or what your record is at the public library. So to me, that's the difference.
Yeah, I think of authoritarian as depth, whereas I think of a totalitarian as width.
Oh, that's very good too.
Now, speaking of your first book, as you mentioned, dissertation was about the Catholic Church. Yep. Today, the Pope was back in the news.
Oh, I don't want to know. I don't know. Do I have to talk about this? What's he saying now?
The Second Amendment didn't come down from Sinai, so it's time to change it. Now, of course, I'm a Baptist, so my first reaction was, well, the Pope didn't come down from Sinai either. So but any thoughts on? There were aspects of the Pope's openness to certain non-conservative components, however you want to put it, that I thought could be promising in terms of the church dealing with certain histories and problematic aspects of how they've used power in certain places. But mostly he's just become a woke Pope, and it's really been distressing to witness it. Any thoughts on the Second Amendment didn't come down from Sinai, we should just ignore it?
If you could read, and you can, of course, in the age of the internet, you can read documents written by Pope Pius XII in the 1950s, or Pius X in the early 20th century. You read these documents, and these are documents written by badasses, who understand who they are and that they're not here to please the powers that be. It seems to me that Pope Francis, almost everything he does is calculated. It's almost like, please, everybody, I know you don't like the crazy costume I wear and the crazy religious ceremonies I do, but please let me into your exclusive club. It's a pathetic display. He's utterly unimpressive intellectually, this guy. And in my opinion, and now I'm going to, of the Catholic viewers are now going to turn it off in disgust, but I think he's an apostate. I actually don't think he has the Catholic faith. I prove me wrong, but I observe it. If he does, then he's acting in an absolutely bizarre, inexplicable way. So, the Second Amendment thing is like almost the least of his problems. And then secondly, if you have to tell me how humble you are, you're not humble. The whole thing about, look at my simplicity, and I'm not going to wear this, and I'm not going to live in the papal household. I'm going to live over here, and I'm going to, come on, right? And not to mention, everybody will tell you that privately, the way he governs the church, forget about this public face of mercy and liberalism. He governs it with an iron fist. And again, this is a very interesting parallel with the rest of society. His predecessor, Benedict XVI, was a right-wing liberal. I mean, basically all the popes since Vatican II have been either left-wing or right-wing liberals. There've been no traditional Catholics since Vatican II. But Benedict was a right-wing liberal because he does believe in the seven sacraments, and he believes in the moral teaching of the church. He believes that some things, though, are kind of up for grabs, but he did try to bring the traditional liturgy of the church back and things like that. But Benedict would be the sort of person who he would appoint somebody as bishop because that guy has, he's put in his time and he's been around a long time, even though he may disagree with me. That is not the way Francis looks at it. I am going to make this church over into my image if it's the last thing I do, is the way he governs it. And so again, that's the difference between how one side looks at governing and how the other side does. One side is, well, let's try to make sure everybody has a voice. And the other side is, yeah, there'll be a voice, all right, but it's going to be mine.
Well, let me ask you this. Your dissertation, I took the name down, but I didn't get it clearly enough to reread. What was your dissertation on in terms of a thesis?
I was interested in the progressive era, so early 20th century history. And I always thought it was interesting that in my textbook, I never saw anybody who was critical of anything that happened in the progressive era. And I thought somebody must have been. Somebody didn't like John Dewey and his educational theories, right? There must have been somebody. There must have been somebody who didn't like the philosophy of William James, right? Somebody somewhere must have been a critic of this stuff. So I thought, I wonder what Catholics were saying at the time, because they were pretty hardcore in those days, really hardcore. There were no felt banners and dancing girls in the sanctuary in 1910, So let's see what these people had to say. So I went back and looked at old Catholic periodicals from that time, and man, were these people hardcore. And I thought, there's something here. No one's ever written about this. It was an intellectual history of Catholicism during the progressive era. And one of the things that has gone completely unreported about the progressive era was that a lot of intellectuals in the progressive era were saying that what we need in the United States is a new creed that can bind us together, since we all know that only stupid people believe in religion. So that's not going to work. So we need a new creed, a secular creed that can bind us. And we got to create that. Now, this creed has to be a creed that is that encourages people to be open-minded and flexible, so that they can flex with what the elites want, basically. Well, now imagine what somebody who teaches that, what would they think about the Catholic school system, which is teaching dogmatic truths to everybody and is not teaching flexibility and let's all have the same creed and they're teaching we have the exclusive, we have the truth. Well, we can't have that in a modern democratic society. There is no truth. Or we come to the truth together, with our new creed. And the Catholics saw this and they said, ain't no way we're going for this. We are going to be the ones who stand up against this. And so it was an interesting thing to see. Here are Catholics trying to assimilate into American society, trying to show that they're not weirdo aliens. But at the same time, the elite intellectuals of American society are kind of saying, you better change the way you look at the world, because it's not compatible with the democracy that we favor. In fact, John Dewey believed that the Catholic school system was an absolutely outrageous instrument against democracy. So I chronicled this in that book. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a book written for academics and published by an academic press. But I think, a Catholic layman who's curious about what the Catholic Church was like merely 2 lifetimes ago, or 1.5, I think would find something valuable in it.
Now, how did you stumble across one of my favorite American historical popular intellectuals, as I would call him, in the Thomas Paine tradition, Lysander Spooner? Because I've always liked Lysander Spooner, fascinating. He started off as a real true believer in American constitutionalism. He wrote a great text with Frederick Douglass, The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. Yep. I think it's absolutely right, by the way. It was actually a listed exhibit in the Wesley Snipes trial, had he ever testified.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
So but then he ultimately becomes kind of a leader of American anarchistic intellectual thought, in large part because of his bitter disappointment at watching the corruption of the American legal system, both in the legislative branch, the executive branch, and in particular the judicial branch, which he started off as a true blue believer in. How did you come across Lysander Spooner?
Well, I guess in those years when I back in 93, 94, and then maybe 92, I started going to libertarian organizations, events for students. And one of those had a sample from the Constitution of No Authority. And I just thought, I don't know if I'm in the right room for this. It took me a little while to get acclimated to some of this radicalism. But once I did become, I had exactly the same interest in him that you have. I find him fascinating as a person, but also his ideas are fascinating, especially because in this day and age now, the Supreme Court has become front and center again. People are talking about different ways of interpreting the Constitution. And he's very different he's not a living, breathing Constitution guy, but he's also not an original intent guy either. His approach, of course, as you know, I'm saying this for the audience, but his approach was original meaning, that I can't be bound by what some people said behind closed doors in some room that I wasn't even in. I can only be bound by the words they put on the paper. And his view was that since slavery is such an outrage against natural law, we have to interpret any apparent reference to slavery in the Constitution as if it's not in favor of slavery, unless the words absolutely demand that interpretation. And he says none of them do. The word slavery is not in the Constitution. And if you look at every clause that is supposed to refer to slavery, I can give you a perfectly benign definition, a perfectly benign interpretation of it. And so therefore, we should abide by that benign interpretation rather than admit the outrage that there could be slavery authorized in the Constitution. That's a very interesting approach. And it was a minority approach among abolitionists. Most of them, like William Lloyd Garrison, felt like the Constitution was a compact with the devil because it authorized slavery. And he did his best to argue against it. So I actually find that a very, very interesting line of argument to pursue. Let's look at what the words meant. And the thing is, whereas if you were an original intent if you were involved in jurisprudence of original intent, you would look back and say, well, it's quite clear they intended these to refer to slavery, so therefore they do. And his view was, I don't care what they intended. I care what they wrote. And they didn't write that that's what they wanted to do, so we're not doing it.
Exactly. I mean, it's a more of a populist interpretation, because my view is what makes the Constitution is what the ordinary person thought when they voted on it to some degree. We should start with the text. And to the degree there's some common understanding that can be popularly uncovered and discovered, great. I have always been a skeptic of all of this original intent aspect, because it invites the selectivity of historians who can, there's a lot of stuff we can't know. Like all of my great grandparents, every Barnes in Rhode Island, voted no on the original Constitution because there was no Bill of Rights. So there's no Bill of Rights, not interested. And Rhode Island even tried to hold out, tried to print our own currency, oppose the centralized national army. Of course, they sent in the army, so we were like, okay, we apologize, never mind. We'll just put that in our diaries for future generations. But I think he was absolutely right about that. And it's not common within the liberal academy, but often, like, what I find fascinating, populism as an idea, or you could call it liberty or freedom in other contexts. The ordinary person often has these ideas, but the academy often shuns them. And so, because I think Spooner and Douglas were right. There's also other arguments, but even Blackstone and other people said that unless you clearly defined who and what is a slave, no one could be a slave. Unless you put it, because it was so abhorrent to natural law, right, it had to be specifically outlined. And if we were going to do an original intent debate, they all knew that when they wrote the Constitution. They all were aware of.
And that's the same principle in Somerset's case in the 18th century. Somerset's case involved a slave who set foot on, I guess it was British soil. And the argument was, well, since slavery is an outrage against natural law, if there isn't any positive law establishing it, it has to be presumed not to exist. So therefore, he's freed by virtue of stepping onto free soil. This is all really interesting stuff. I could talk about this all day.
And I think it's an underappreciated, undervalued aspect of the historical debate. Because the other thing is, I see William Lloyd Garrison and that wing of abolitionism as the Yankee totalitarians' great-great-granddaddy of today. And they had a similar obsession with being, like, take, for example, the anti-war left in America, especially since the 1960s. In that Garrison was obsessed with saying slavery condemned America. That showed America was bad, the Constitution was bad, our founding was bad, etc. Whereas you look at Lysander Spooner, he was more in the Huey Long, Martin Luther King, others who said, no, our Constitution is great, and we should assume it was great. And if we apply that, it actually says slavery is not legal here. if you understand it from a certain. And it's not only a different legal intellectual approach, but it's a different approach to America. Like today in the anti-war movement, my view is the anti-war movement has been badly undermined by an anti-American bias that has existed since the 1960s. Historically, Americans were deeply anti-foreign entanglement. John Quincy Adams' speech is still famous today because that was the mindset. We don't go abroad searching for monsters to destroy, lest we effectively become the monster ourselves. We be the exemplar of liberty by not being the imperial colonizer that we have just escaped from in Europe. And we definitely don't get entangled in European wars, yet here we are today, back entangled in the European war. But so much of like the anti-war left that that I say that they often should get a check from the war machine, because in the 60s, all of a sudden, to be anti-war is to be anti-American.
Right.
To be anti-war means you burn the flag. To be
Right.
anti-war means you spit on the soldier. That wasn't the tradition of anti-war in America at all. Indeed, it's amazing how many Republicans have forgot. Republicans were the non-interventionist party up until the 1950s.
Yeah.
And suddenly, Josh Hawley's rediscovering those roots, probably because of popular blowback, but it's still good to see him.
I don't care what the reason is, as long as they do the right thing.
Exactly. How much do you think, can you, the old right, the populist right, is a deep anti-war movement that's pro-American, and because it's pro-American, very anti-foreign entanglement, very anti-interventionist, very anti-war, as often as, and that's really the dominant American historical political trend, not the sort of deviant late 1960s people mad at their daddies want to burn the flag, folks.
Right. And as a matter of fact, I personally think that Vietnam is an anomaly. I think for the most part, at least the establishment left has favored war. In the Spanish-American War, you see all kinds of progressives saying we need to make over Spain. We have to punish Spain for its lack of progressivity. World War I, overwhelmingly, you can count on one hand how many left-wing intellectuals were against. Jane Addams, Randolph Bourne, and who the hell else? Almost nobody. They were all in favor of the war, partly because they thought it would be an avenue of domestic reconstruction, that the opportunity presented by the war would mean an opportunity to plan the economy, an opportunity to train the people to understand that limited government is a thing of the past, and that we are going to dictate resource allocation and whatever else. All you have to do is read the New Republic magazine, which was always at war with the Old Republic, but it was started around 1913 or 14, right around the time of World War I. And if you read them, they are fanatically demanding entry into World War I. And this just goes on. Even during the Cold War, basically the establishment left was in favor of almost all those interventions. And then after the Cold War, they have favored pretty much all the interventions. Now, it's true. You can tell me that there's Caitlin Johnstone in Australia and Jimmy Dore, and I love those people, and God bless them. But the fact that we can name all of them tells you something's wrong on the left. That I can name. And again, on the right, I can kind of name for you all the prominent anti-war people on the right, but I think more and more that's the side where you're seeing the anti-war stuff come out. Whereas it's the establishment left that wants to call you a pawn of Russia if you're anti-war, or what are you, support Saddam Hussein, whatever it is, you can't even have a rational conversation.
Now that you mention it, because I flagged one of these, starred, not flagged, a super chat from earlier, I didn't understand the question. Why don't you want to save the people of Ukraine? Now I think contextually, Tom, I haven't followed you for very long on Twitter. I presume now, by being anti-war, people twist that into saying you don't care about the people of Ukraine and you're willing to let innocent people die by virtue of your non-interventionist philosophy. What's the response? I don't want to say it for you, but what's the response to that?
Yeah, the response is, in the real world, sometimes you're not faced with a good option and a bad option. Sometimes you're faced with all bad options, and you have to choose the one that's least likely to wind up destroying the whole world. So it's not a matter of, well, if I press this button, everybody is saved, but if I press that button, Ukraine gets whatever. We can't come on now. We've got to grow up from that stuff. So what's happening right now, it seems to me, is pushing us toward a situation where I don't think deaths are going to be minimized. I think the possibility of an even larger scale conflict has been growing, and I don't think that would be good for anybody. And I don't think I mean, even to hear some of the elites even quietly saying, well, a small scale nuclear war is actually winnable. Like, I don't want to hear them talking like that. So
I think there was an article, I don't know where it was, Huffington Post 10 years ago. A small scale nuclear war might actually be good for global warming. I swear to you, you can Google it.
I saw that too. And the thing is, I can't solve every problem on Earth. And U.S. intervention has generally caused more problems than it's solved. But I can't solve all those problems. And moreover, I am, and this was what J.D. Vance got in big trouble for, and I thought what he said made perfect sense. It's, I wish the people of Ukraine well, but I'm primarily concerned about what's going on with my people right here. Well, the thing is, that's the natural morality that has existed throughout the world since the beginning of time, that it is not my job to go looking for problems to solve outside my household. First, my responsibility is to my household. Then it's to my extended family. Then it's to my friends. Then it's to my town. It can't possibly be to every conflict in the world, which, if we're being consistent, we would have to be concerned about all these. I don't have the moral capacity to consume all this, and I don't have the material capacity to, and even if I did, sometimes they say, well, you have to intervene against this bad guy because otherwise, this bad guy will cause all these problems. If I intervene against that bad guy, that gives the green light to other bad guys that, well, the U.S. is tied down over here. Now I can, you see, there is no simple solution to all this. What we're facing is the human condition. And the best way we know of to minimize conflict is not to risk a showdown between the two major powers in the world, but to do what we can to diplomatically get our way out of it. And no one's talking like that. No one is saying we need to find no one's even looking for a diplomatic solution. And so meanwhile, Ukraine is just being dragged around and dragged around and dragged around by people who claim to champion it. But all they're doing is winding up having them endure more and more suffering. So I can't solve all the problems of the world. And we can't solve this problem without risking destroying the world.
No, but I was listening to Dan Crenshaw, his full interview with Trey Gowdy, who I didn't realize is now, working with Fox News. And, they basically say the quiet part out loud, which is, this is a good time for us to use Ukraine to fight a proxy war with Russia. And now people are accusing you of not caring for the Ukraine or Ukrainians by virtue of saying we should back away from this, as opposed to what they're saying, which is, let's use Ukrainian civilians and Ukraine to fight a proxy war, no American soldiers and no civilian deaths, but it's going to be Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian civilian deaths by virtue of a proxy war that we want to fight. We're going to seize this opportunity to do it. I would flip the question around and say, what you're doing, what you're specifically supporting, is uniquely bad for innocent Ukrainian civilians, period. But alas, it seems that the leftist media controls the dialogue, controls the narrative. So if you're anti-confrontation with Russia, you just want Ukrainians to die, in as much as if you were anti-lockdown, you just wanted Granny to die.
Oh, geez, yeah, that's exactly what it's been, and it's always. What was the name of that woman who famously interviewed Jordan Peterson and she misstated every one of his arguments? Kathy something?
Yeah, well, it was the British lady who did the same thing to Lavrov. So Lavrov, the Russian ambassador, appears on her channel, and she accuses him of, she asked him when is he going to be ready for his war crimes trial. I mean, it's that routine, and especially the British of the British Empire. I mean, the lack of historical awareness. But the other thing is, I thought this also fits into sort of a certain context, which is about that war is used, that the pretext to enter mass global war or war anywhere, total war mindset mentality seems a variation of the sort of the rise of the managerial, professional, clerical class controlling governmental institutions. Like I call it, people kind of recognize it with communism. They semi-recognize it with fascism. The myth of leftist historians has been to pretend fascists were capitalists when they were not. They weren't seizing property because they were capitalists. But really also corporate progressivism in the West. This sort of or progressive corporatism, however you want to utilize it. Its own version of fascistic power, just a little bit differently. But for corporate progressivism, the excuse for state power, the excuse to give some philosophy major a job, is always some poor population, some vulnerable population, some abused population. So it's in the name of, poor immigrants and poor black voters and other poor voters that they decide to create a state ballot. Well, how does that state ballot then get used? It gets used to keep third parties and independent candidates off the ballot.
Mhm.
It gets used to break the back of political machines in urban ethnic centers and in the parts of the rural South because you have a lot of illiteracy. So now they no longer are given their ballot before they go in. So that a lot of what was seen as reform for democracy, what they really mean by democracy is their class gets to run the rest of us.
Yes.
It's not real democratizing power in the hands of the individual, in the hands of the small businessman, in the hands of the ordinary worker, in the hands of the ordinary person. And war is just an extension of it. It's always like that's where, as you were talking about, Bob Dole, 1976 vice presidential debate with Walter Mondale. He said, if I could count up all the dead from all the Democrat wars,
Yeah.
which is one of my all-time favorite
The
statements.
best thing he ever said, and he spent the rest of his life apologizing for it.
I know, it's like he shouldn't be. That's Kansas Republicanism. That's East Tennessee style Republicanism, which was, most of them were Republican because they hated all the wars. Like when I was talking to J.D. Vance and he was trying to decide how aggressive do I express my opinions on Ukraine, because I'm going to have this whole deep state apparatus attack me. I'm going to have the media, the money, all of that's going to come after me. But my instincts are, I served in Iraq based on a lie. I'm not going to send any other kids to die on a lie.
Yeah.
And so he did, but I was like, you're in Ohio. This is Senator Robert Taft, the senator who voted against the United States joining NATO in the late 1940s, who was one of the most popular Republicans in the country for a reason. That's the history. It's a history that the Wall Street Journals and the National Reviews and the Rupert Murdochs have denied people from knowing about and understanding in ordinary Republican politics.
One of the editors of National Review just tweeted out the other day something along the lines of, I can't get over the selfishness of people in the West. Pay a few extra bucks for gas. Look at the sacrifices they're making in Ukraine. I thought, what do I need you for? I already have MSNBC and CNN and for the most part, Fox News. What do I need you for? What kind of an alternative are you? So I've come to the conclusion now. I'm getting more red-pilled all the time, and yet I thought I was the king of the red pill. So I'm getting more red-pilled all the time, and so I'm increasingly convinced. And this is going to sound so obvious to half your listeners, but it took me a while to get to this point. That the elites. Well, first of all, the elites do not have our well-being at heart. First of all, but I think it's more than they don't have our well-being at heart. It's almost like they've declared war on us. They want to take away inexpensive energy, not just from us, but from the developing world, where it's lethal to take away inexpensive energy. They want us. They want to impose crazy. They want to put crazy worldviews into our kids' heads and not tell us about it. They want us eating like soy burgers instead of meat. They want us to eat sludge. And then remember, these are the same people who for years and years said, don't eat eggs. Don't eat eggs? What's wrong with you? Now, could it be coincidental that every damn thing these people favor involves making our lives worse? If it were just a coincidence, occasionally they would do something that improves our lives. They would just fall ass backwards into it. And that never happens.
There's a concept called fractal wrongness. Every step, every decision they make would be wrong, and you would not be able to get there even by random chance. Flip a coin, you're going to hit heads every now and again. But if fractal wrongness, if it were accidental, it would be unexplainable or inexplicable.
You should write a book called Fractal Wrongness. That would be awesome.
It's a beautiful concept where every decision they've made has been wrong. And we'll get into COVID sooner than later, but every decision along the line in COVID has been wrong in the sense in that it will cause more damage than any good it could have ever done in the first place. And Tom, I brought up a chat of my own that said, I don't know that you've realized that after red pill is black pill, but don't get to the black pill. The double red pill or the red pill suppository is before the black pill. Yeah. Eat bugs. First of all, I've tasted bugs before COVID. They're fine. But when someone tells you you're going to own nothing and be happy, and then that goes from conspiracy theory to reality, you do start to wonder if the goal is to not revert back to what has been the historical consistency, not the anomaly that is America, which is, I don't know, feudal society might not be the right word, but we're ruled by superiors, and freedom the American experiment was the anomaly and not the rule. And we're just going to go right back to having landlords, superiors who tell the lowly hoi polloi how they have to live. This brings me back to one question. What is libertarianism as a concept? And how does it play into preserving what has been the most beautiful thing of the American experiment of democracy?
Sure. First of all, in case anybody's curious, I'm not drinking alcohol. This is liquid death. It's actually just spring water. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but they call it that. The way they get away, they just wanted to call it liquid death, but the way they explain it away is it murders your thirst. So that was our sponsor message for this episode.
I'm going straight to liquiddeath.com to see.
Yeah, oh, they're awesome. I love these people so much. And on the side, they have the story of the. It's so beautiful. Anyway, well, in a way, this has made me. All these realizations that I've had have made me more of a libertarian in a way, because every once in a while you're tempted to think, well, maybe the state could do a better job on this particular thing, or maybe it would be better if we could just raise a lot of money quickly, and the state is good at that, and we could do this and that. But I look at the decisions these people make, and they are so consistently catastrophically bad that I just feel like even if there is a case where it would be easier for us to complete a project if we could just coerce a lot of people, you know what? We'll fundraise on the internet and solve it that way. But there's just no way we can give the American establishment any more power.
And can you explain the difference between society and the state? Like, I often tell people, you don't have to have the state. You don't have to give this small group of people disparate power over the rest of us and the legal right of violence over the rest of us. And then you throw economic violence in our current, currency-driven system into that equation. In order to have the benefits of society, people have throughout all of history organized collectively to do very good, positive things without the existence of the state.
Exactly right. By the way, I'm distracted because I see some of these great comments, like about the Anti-Imperialist League, which I love. I gave a talk on them once. But I hear you. I mean, that's exactly the way I think. So in terms of society and the state, as you say, is basically the organization of violence. So that is to say, the state is the institution in society that is said to have the power to initiate violence and collect taxes. Or I repeat myself. But society is what we might call the voluntary sector of our world, and that is the sector in which we operate 99% of the time. When you mow my lawn, I pay you $25. And there's no coercion involved, no threats. Society is where the creativity comes from. Is where we give free rein to people to try things out and see if they work, see if they don't work. Society is where we don't have organized coercion, and you can make your decision. And in a way, the democracy helps to show us the difference between society and the state, because when we're dealing with a political election, well, we have two choices, sometimes three choices. And if 51% goes for one choice, if there are only two of them, then everybody has to live with that one choice. Everybody has to live with that. Whereas when it comes to music, if not everybody likes my brand of progressive rock, well, they don't all have to listen to it, because we don't have some collective vote that then determines everybody has to do the same thing. Everybody has to eat the same ice cream flavor. Society is where we all are able to have our individual choices. We're able to live according to those, and we're able to live in peace with our neighbor according to those. So whatever social trend you see that you think is destructive, it tends to be amplified. It tends to be a trend that the state wants to be part of. And so I find that whether it's undermining the family or pushing quote unquote equality or whatever it is, the state loves it, because it means the state gets to pry its way into the most intimate details of the lives of the people. And or when I mentioned equality, because equality is a word that sounds good, right? Everybody seems to favor equality on some level, but equality is one of these weasel words that can kind of mean anything. Do you mean equality of opportunity? Do you mean equality of result? Do you mean equality of material condition? What do you mean? Well, it can always mean something different, which means the state will never run out of ways to intervene in your life, or rob you, or make you miserable, because it can never ultimately reach that goal. Robert Nozick used to give this example. back in the days of Wilt Chamberlain playing basketball. Suppose we have a situation where everybody is materially equal, and then Wilt Chamberlain goes and plays basketball. Everybody wants to watch him play. And so everybody pays $1 to go watch him play. Well, after that transaction is over, we no longer have equality because now Wilt Chamberlain has a ton of money and everybody in the stands has slightly less than they had before. So what are we supposed to do then? Is Wilt Chamberlain supposed to give all the money back and we start all over? I mean, what does this mean? Like, what are you even aiming at? But it's one of these concepts that because it can never be reached, the state loves it. Or the war on drugs. They'll never be successful with that. So they love it. They thrive on it because there are interest groups now that get paid big salaries. They get all these resources, and you can never actually break out of it. So my view is I don't want to launch any of these wars on drugs, poverty, inequality, whatever it is. It always makes the situation worse. It always impoverishes us, and it enriches the most parasitic, backward, awful sociopaths in society. So I am more libertarian than ever now.
So
Don't you dare ask me who's going to build the roads. And that's somebody from Sweden. I was just in Stockholm a couple weeks ago. The only people wearing masks in Stockholm are American tourists.
well, Tom, who's going to build the roads? Like, forget who built the cages. So what is? Here's the thing. Like, I studied philosophy. I studied Thomas Locke. I know what I didn't even know that it was called libertarianism. I don't think, except in retrospect. What is libertarianism as a political philosophy, and why is it so underrepresented on a political ideological scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what it is, you can say very, very briefly. Libertarianism, like any political philosophy, is on some level concerned with figuring out when the use of violence is acceptable. And the libertarian places a very high threshold on when violence is acceptable. It's acceptable in self-defense, but the principal moral code or proposition of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, which just simply says you shouldn't initiate aggression against a peaceful person. Now, most people hear that and they say, well, I already believe that, and I'm not a libertarian, but I already believe that. I don't go around punching people at random. I already believe that. But when you really unpack this statement, you realize how radical it is. Because if you really take it literally, it really means no state at all. Now, not all libertarians take it to that degree, but basically almost any state you can think of operates on a principle of that, well, we can initiate aggression, but you can't. And then we get back to the problem that Robert raised, which is the people who are endowed with the right to initiate aggression tend not to be the best people in our society. So it's a difficult problem. So yeah, so then the question is, why, if we're so great, why haven't we been more successful politically? Well, I don't really want to, if I can avoid it, talk about the internal problems in the Libertarian Party. I think there is an issue in the U.S. with the two parties are just so dominant, it's hard for people to break out of that. But think about what the libertarian message really is. It's that every entrenched elite needs to be removed. And that every industry, every group, every whatever that is getting special privileges is going to have them taken away. Now, you can make a great populist message out of that. And I mean, that is a fantastic populist message. But whoa, there's no elite that the elites will wage unrelenting war on that message. They are never going to let that get any traction. So what they would prefer is something like the Republican Party, where some of the members will occasionally talk like this, but with a little bit of a wink. And the people in Switzerland all know they don't really mean any of that. I do think there are some people in the Republican Party these days who do mean it. I actually think there are some sincere people increasingly. And of course, you can tell they're the sincere people because they are the ones who are demonized and have their names dragged through the mud and ridiculed and laughed at. And I guess the thing that really bothers me is to see how many, I understand why the elites would be against a message like this. I get it. Of course they would. But to go on Twitter and see regular Americans using the elites hashtags, seeing regular Americans signing on for what are obviously elite projects. I mean, the whole climate change thing, that is an elite project only. And to see regular people signing on for that, when this is just designed to make them miserable, it really has been discouraging for me to see that. And that's why for me, COVID was such a disorienting moment for me, because I still had this idea that deep down there burns within the human soul this desire for liberty. And to see so many people not even be curious about whether any of these restrictions were doing any good, not even being curious about it, just saying, well, that guy in that white lab coat says I should do it, so I better do it. Not even, I guess I better ruin my life and have all my savings dwindle away and have my family not get the surgery they need because some people told me. Oh man, that was a wake-up call for me. So here I am on the verge of 50. I still have things to learn. I don't have all the answers after all.
Well, it was really a return to the early 20th century, a combination of progressive corporatism or corporate progressivism, however people want to label it, because it was the eugenics agenda back when the white lab coats could dictate to us. They are actually bringing back eugenics decisions, the Jacobson decision that was used to justify forced vaccinations. That was just really a small fine if you didn't get one, but was used. It was the sole decision in Buck v. Bell, the sole decision that said we can go around and tell poor people who can have kids and who can't. And the Supreme Court was arrogant about it. People forget that, like, at some point, they got to write a book called The Ugly History of the U.S. Supreme Court. Take all their most atrocious, offensive, horrific decisions just to mock them into eternity for some of those cases. Because people forget some of the justices that get celebrated by both the left and the right today. We're happy to say 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Right.
I mean, they were arrogant and contemptuous. But to see the fear-minded mentality, particularly in the big tech universe, amplify everything that the public health apparatus was always about in the COVID context was extraordinary to witness. I mean, we went through something that's never happened in human history. No state has shut down the entire society because of a virus. They didn't even shut down during the Black Plague. I mean, and yet here we were in what was basically an amplified flu for most people, running around terrified. There's still people in LA. They'll be driving by themselves in their car with the windows down, still triple masked. It's like, well, it's insanity times insanity.
Yeah. By the way, let me just say in parentheses, just quickly about something you said about the Supreme Court and the ugly history of the Supreme Court. Back when I was more white pill minded, I actually years ago thought about kind of the opposite book. I'd like to see a book of the dissenting opinions in some of the really bad cases and see how we could have argued to a good result in those cases. Because I bet there's a lot of great jurisprudence buried in some of those decisions.
Oh yeah, no doubt there is. I mean, in particular, I mean, I think there was one dissent in Buck v. Bell as an example. I mean, so there was some wise sage. That's where you got some of the better logic, some of the better wisdom, some of the better arguments. But like, I wasn't totally shocked by the as soon as I started seeing it built, it reminded me of the past. In other words, there's a reason why the statists loved COVID. Like the Cuban government is undergoing its current economic problems, not because of the sanctions. I'm not a fan of the sanctions, and the sanctions don't help them, but they're in trouble because they wanted to prove to the world how wonderful their government is because they could prevent COVID from ever coming to Cuba by canceling tourism that crushed a third of their economy. And they still don't know how to manage sugar. They can't produce sugar like they did in the 60s. But
yeah, no, I hear. Well, look, Jane Fonda said that COVID is God's gift to the left. I mean, she just flat out said it. But by the way, you can tell I have daughters. I'm using an ice cream cone pen because it's the only one I've got around.
By the way, I haven't forgotten about that, Tom. 5 daughters, and not you need a boy in there, but 5 daughters, and you're still married, I presume. So that's 6 women. Do you have a pet in the house?
Well, a cat. We've got a cat.
Oh my God, that makes more. Oh,
but the cat's female, by the way.
That's 2. That counts for 2. Then you're up to 8. Okay.
But honest to goodness, really, every time I used to give speeches where I would start off, especially when they were younger, because now the oldest one is 18. But when they were young, like we had 3 under 3 at the beginning. And I would give speeches and I would say, by the way, I have these children. And I would get these gasps from the audience. They couldn't believe that I was doing this. But honestly, I can't imagine, not having any one of them. Like each. And the thing is, I'm an only child, as I said at the beginning. So I kind of thought, you put the same inputs into each child, they come out the same. What do I know? And they're all so different. And I just love each particular difference in each particular one. But anyway, but if I can jump back into the COVID thing really, really quickly, I did a couple of things because I've been writing I've been writing a newsletter for many years, but for the past couple of years, my newsletter kind of turned into like the COVID daily report because that's what everybody I was writing to wanted to hear. And occasionally I would stray from that. Like I'd write a little bit about George Floyd or something, and they'd say, yeah, get back to what we signed up for. So I did a couple of things because this was driving me crazy. I thought, am I the only one who notices that none of this is doing any good? So I did two things. So I'd like to, if I may, give out two websites. So one of them is called chartstheyforgot.com. And at chartstheyforgot.com is my free ebook called COVID Charts CNN Forgot. And in that, I would put things like, okay, here's a graph of the Midwest in 2020. And remember, we were told that at Thanksgiving, there's going to be a major spike. Okay, I have taken the dates off the chart. Show me where Thanksgiving is. Of course, you can't because it's all random. So then I've got a chart in there. Iowa dropped all of its state level restrictions in February. We're in June now. This was 2021. Here's a graph of the outcomes for all the Midwestern states. I'm sure Iowa must be way the outlier. So it'll be really easy. Go ahead, pick out Iowa. You can't. So, and I just do this over and over in that ebook. Well, then the second thing I want to say is then I made this into an interactive kind of game. I made it into a quiz you're bound to fail. So I came up with a website called covidchartsquiz.com. So it's COVID charts with an S quiz.com. And in this is a quiz you're designed to fail. So it'll have two lines and it'll say, okay, one of these places locked down really hard, did the following whatever. The second one didn't. Pick out which is which. Or here are graphs of European countries and they're either their death or hospitalization numbers. Here are all these different ones. They've all had mask mandates. On each one, pick out, show me where the mask mandate went into effect. Must be obvious, right? I bet the numbers fell immediately after that. Then go ahead, pick out, show me. And of course, the results are completely random.
You cannot bring this up and not expect me to do it in real time. Hold on. How long does it take to take the quiz? Take the quiz. Do we do this or do you don't want me to do this?
It'll take a while is the problem. There's so many questions in it.
Well, let's just see what it looks like.
Which state has a, quote, really good governor, according to Dr. Fauci? And which one doesn't?
Okay, now hold on. May I ask you a question? Is the red and the blue intended to deceive here? If I were going to do this, I would have used like orange.
Yeah, it's not meant to be red state governor or anything like that.
Which one has a good governor? I'm going to go reverse psychology.
Reverse psychology has a good governor. And then
do I get the answer right away, or do I have to get like to the IQ test? And do I have to give my email address to get the results?
No, you don't. No, you don't. There is no opt-in required. But if you want my free ebook, you can click the bottom and get it. So
okay, we're not going to go through it. All that I know is how many of those IQ tests I've taken where I do the test and then I have to give my credit card at the end to get my results. Right. I must be dumb. That's the bottom line.
No, for this one, I decided no opt-in necessary, but I do have a little plug for my ebook at the bottom in case people want it. So it's very, very light on requesting people's email addresses.
Cool.
I mean, I consider the best argument against the state is just see the state's response, the government's response to COVID around the world. There's no better example of what an utter abominable failure they are. They made everything worse. They made kid situations worse. They made mental health worse, physical health worse. Our mortality rate went up more after the so-called vaccines than they did before the so-called vaccines.
That's long, Robert. That's long COVID. Don't challenge the science there. We can't get into trouble here. That's long COVID. Nothing else. Sorry.
It was fantastic. The reason I visited Sweden a couple of weeks ago was that my trip was postponed. I had wanted to take it, I think, in October of last year. And then Sweden very abruptly said, starting on such and such date, Americans and a couple other countries, they can't come in anymore. I think Israel, a couple other, but can't come in. And my trip was scheduled for a week after that happened. And I had scheduled the trip because I was so sick of walking around seeing people masked that I just said, I just want to be in a society where there's none of this. So by the time I got there, a lot more places were like that, but still it was like almost no trace of it. The only trace of it I really saw was they still, in some places like the Royal Palace and other places, they still have the 6 feet or the 2 meters away signs. And I fantasize about going to the grocery store and dressing up like a clerk and scraping those things off the floor. And if anybody asked me, I'd say, oh, we're getting new ones in, and then I would just leave. I just won't get all these things up. And then the other thing is, because of my personality, I mean, I'm mostly a live and let live person. I mean, that is kind of the libertarian thing. But as a libertarian, you can still criticize people. Just because you don't use violence against them, you can still. The idea is you use reason rather than coercion. And when I see people wearing these suffocation, I call them either suffocation masks or duck masks. I just think, what I can't. Or you know what? In a way, even worse now, after everything we've heard, like even the COVID people are telling you, except Fauci, the rest of them are saying those stupid cloth masks don't do anything, and we admit that now. And yet you still see people wearing them. I want to say to them, what do you think that's doing? Or I actually got to, some people got upset at me on Twitter. I said, at this point, when I walk past somebody who has a duck beak on, I just quack at them. And I had people saying, oh, you should just live and let live. If you're going along with, at least implicitly, this crazy dystopian regime, if the worst thing that happens to you is you get quacked at, then consider yourself lucky.
I have wanted to stop people just to ask them, but I have two fears. One is probably more a prejudgment, I guess. I want to ask them, why are you wearing this outside? I just want to know what's going on in their head, but I'm actually scared because I think that a person who's doing that still now might react very aggressively or different. So I can't do it. But I just want to bring one thing up. Just speaking of, it's another thing where had you said it 2 years ago, I'm just going to read the article. I'm not going to comment on it, commentate. The COVID, I'm going to jump over words, may impair long-term immunity. This is coming from IsraelNationalNews.com.
COVID vaccines.
Research suggesting. It's like, who could have seen this coming 2 years ago, except the people who saw it coming 2 years ago, who were shunned, kicked off of social media, scrubbed off of Wikipedia.
And by the way, this kind of comes full circle back to the Mises Institute, because when we had the financial crisis of 2008, oh my goodness, how many people we had saying no one could have seen this coming. Well, at the Mises Institute, my friend Mark Thornton, who had the office right next to me, Mark Thornton had been talking about the housing collapse for several years, and with all the numbers and laying it all out very clearly for people to see. But because we're not part of the elite, nobody cared. And then so Paul Krugman, who also didn't see it coming, I mean, not really. His thing was, he actually said, way too many people are asking how we get into this mess and not asking how we get out. But how you get out of a mess is almost always related to how you got into it. So it is important to talk about that. Or James Galbraith said, oh, maybe there were a dozen people who just stumbled upon predicting this years ago. And of course, none of those dozen are our people. And so, yeah, actually, if you listen to the people, I mean, it's almost a rule of thumb now. If you really want to understand what's going on, I mean, it's true. There are some quacks out there who are going to give you bad health advice, bad economic advice. That's true. But if you want to get pretty reliable information on almost anything now, health, the economy, whatever it is, you have to look somewhere other than the mainstream. And the Mises Institute just has an excellent track record on this stuff. And they're not perma bears. They're not people who constantly say there's going to be a recession, and then inevitably they wind up being right eventually. That's not who they are.
Well, yeah, it's been two things have been fascinating. One about like everything happening with COVID and the rest. That on the economic side, the criticism from the George Gammons of the world, the people that are follow the Austrian school, that are of that realpolitik mindset, was you can't just print all of this and expect there to be no consequences. You can't double the money supply in the real economy and think, no inflation's going to come about. Or if it does, it's transitory. And now we're trying to pretend it's, Putin's price hike and all that jazz. It's like, well, first of all, Putin didn't jack up any prices. I mean, we were the ones that issued sanctions. So, that doesn't even apply on its own terms. But we're seeing in live time, the critics are increasingly seeing what their theories are right. And now we're in an economic world, which is kind of a peculiar economic world where the Fed can't really use its tools to try to solve the problem, because the more they raise interest rates, the stock market and housing markets might collapse. And then, maybe you get inflation under control because nobody has any money. So that's not exactly a solution necessarily. But we're seeing in the same way in the global sense. Putin's position back in 1997, based on University of Pittsburgh libertarian-oriented individuals, was that what matters more about power, geopolitical power, is controlling necessities, food, fuel, military power to a certain degree, people, nuclear weapons, etc. Controlling financial power, currency power, a lot of that's fictional. A lot of that is, or it's fictitious. It can disappear overnight. It can vanish quickly. It's built on a lot of illusions. And we're seeing in live time, the sort of the whole globalist crowd was, we can take out Putin because we can take out Russia, though their target really was Putin particularly, not because they're smart, but because that's where they're at. But because we control the global financial institutions. We control the global cultural institutions. We control the global political institutions. We run the IMF and the World Bank. We control the financial and banking and currency systems. The dollar is dominant. We control the cultural institutions. And surely the Russians don't want to be without Netflix for a few weeks. They've discovered just the opposite. Not only the Russians happy not to have Disney anymore, but the ruble is doing better than it's done in about half a decade. And everybody's desperate now for the food and fuel that is now being limited arbitrarily and artificially by European and Western response. What's your thoughts on all
that? Well, first of all, I cannot get over how they get away with blaming everything on Russia, whatever it is. It's not just inflation. It's maybe there was some problem with the Texas power grid, and they thought maybe Russia had done that. Do you realize how stupid you sound when you say that? I mean, even in the worst moments of the Cold War, people weren't that obsessed with the Soviet Union that they would attribute everything going on to them. And secondly, it reminds me that the U.S. regime will never say, like the president will never say, look, we made a mistake here and we're going to try to fix it. He's never made a mistake, Joe Biden. As far as I can see, he's never made a mistake. The inflation's not his fault. The baby formula thing's not his fault. Nothing's his fault. Nothing is his fault. But yet we all know it is. We all know that now inflation. Okay, well that's the Federal Reserve, but you can appoint a better chair of the Federal Reserve, and obviously under Trump we had a lot of inflation of the money supply. I totally get that, but the point is we know these people have done terrible things to us, whether it's the economy, and specifically the housing market all those years ago, or the war in Iraq, or whatever it is. We know, and there are no consequences. They face no consequences. They're not driven out of society. They're not driven out of public life. They face no consequences. A private sector firm that did this to us, we would never hear from them again unless they were favored by the state, which a lot of them are. But we'd never hear from them again. And yet everybody's terrified of the private sector, and they want to go cheer and wave little flags for the public sector. And so, yeah, I'm not anti-quote American, but I am anti the American elite. I'm very much anti the regime, and I'm happy to make that distinction.
It's amazing. You said it now, and now I just put two and two together. The reflexive, it's delusional blaming of Putin. It's the Putin gas hike. By the way, in the States, let me just get this chat off. In the States, the price hike, the gas increase is Putin's fault. In Canada, if you ask our elite here, it's inflation, it's big tech, big oil making big profits. The reflexive blame everything on Russia. It's mutatis mutandis, blame everything on COVID. Someone's sick, COVID. Someone has a stomach ache, COVID. Someone's forgetting stuff, COVID. It's not the lockdowns that's causing mental issues about people forgetting what day it is and short-term memory. COVID. Everything, it was reflexive, it was spiritual, it was almost, I want to say religious, but not to demean religion. It was just superstitious. It's COVID. Everything bad that happens, and now it's everything bad that happens is Putin. It's a tactic employed by the state. But the question is this: how do you fight the tactic when hold on, I just wrote this down earlier. You said you thought the libertarian philosophy of individuals to be free would dominate. I think people have a greater desire to be dominated. They have a greater desire to be given rules to abide by, and they don't want freedom because freedom is scary. Knowing what you have to do at 10 o'clock in the morning is liberating in the sense that it removes your liberty from you.
I have a friend named Jeff Lescavar who has developed a theory about this. He wants to know, for instance, why is it that somebody who thinks a certain way about, the minimum wage or antitrust law or something like that, also thinks the same, has also will share the same opinion of abortion. Like they have nothing to do with each other. Now, it's not true that it's not true in absolutely every case, but it's true in a lot of cases. And why would that be? And so there have been various attempts to answer this question. Thomas Sowell has a great book where it's not Knowledge and Decisions, it's a conflict of visions. And he tries to account for this. But Lescabar says there's a much simpler explanation. It's that a lot of people, for whatever reason, have to be in the in crowd. Like when they were in high school, they would die 1,000 deaths before helping out that unpopular kid who's getting made fun of. Now, today on Facebook, oh, they're all sad about this unpopular kid. You know, now that they're moms and dads, they're sad about the unpopular kid. Or we believe in education, but the reality is when they were in school, they were making fun of that unpopular kid. And the reality is today, yeah, they believe in education, but today, if they read anything, they read some trashy novel on the beach. So I don't believe a word these people say. But the point is, these people, there are a lot of them who they want to be in the in group, and the elites favor certain policies because they bring them more power. This group wants to be in with the elites because the elites are the in group. They are the entertainers. They are the politicians. They're the heads of business. They're the heads of culture. They don't want to be dissidents. They don't want to be the unpopular kid. They need the approval. So they'll repeat whatever they're told to repeat. And it's not like they consciously sit down and say, I must be in the influential group, so I will therefore. It's an instinct thing. And so this helps to account. It's simply they don't want to be in the out group. And the elites are playing on that very, very effectively.
Yeah, it's a very good explanation. I think the other aspect of it is I always say totalitarianism begets more totalitarianism, and a freedom culture begets more freedom. In the sense that, like, you look at cultures and societies that have a history of strong independence. A lot of them are mountain cultures. This goes back to Scotland, East Tennessee, Switzerland. You know, how did the Swiss keep fighting off everybody? They're a bunch of little mountain cultures. And what is a freedom culture begets more self-reliance, more independence, more self-enlightenment is more self-empowerment, and leads to the desire for more and more freedom. In the same sense, I was always going to say, like, a version of Roger Fogham's book, Everything I Needed to Learn, I Learned in Kindergarten. And I was like, that's true. My parents dropped me off at a random authority figure who told me if I didn't do whatever they told me to do, first they were going to deprive me of pleasure, no recess for you, no fruit punch for you, no cookies for you, and then they'll escalate to punishment, social isolation, staying in the corner, social shaming. Back when I went to school, with actual physical punishment. I mean, I got spanked once, got spanked for the first time for trying not to eat my peas, and I got spanked again because I didn't know how to tie my shoe. And all my response was to hate authority. That was my response. Like, I'm not for this. I don't know why should you be running my life? You're just some random schmuck who has to use power to do this. So I think it explains a lot of it. But I think if you grow up in a culture, a family, a society that embraces freedom, and it's one of the great ways to resist totalitarianism is what people do in their individual lives. Homeschooling is an example, or education outside of the state. People are really starting to discover and uncover the dangerousness of state monopolized education. What that looks like. It looks like, your 6-year-old comes home and says maybe they're a girl because their teacher told them about their experiences changing genders. And it's like, whoa, a lot of middle America parents are starting to wake up as they realize how nuts this has all got.
How nuts it is. Right. I just saw one of the comments, and it's exactly what Jeff says, that we may be hardwired, some people in this way, from tribal existence, that if you were expelled from the tribe, then that could be a death sentence.
Dude,
therefore you want to conform.
I would have thrived expelled from the tribe. I would actually be able to move faster alone than in a group. It's an African proverb. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go in a group. I think I'd go faster and further 9 out of 10 times on my own.
Now, by the way, just following up on Robert's thing about people are waking up because they're seeing how radical some of this stuff is. If the Republican Party knew what it was doing and actually wanted to win, as opposed to being terrified of the elites, they would force the Democrats to run on these radical propositions, because that puts the Democrats in a no-win situation, because they don't want to run on these. I mean, except the true believers. And if they're forced to run on it, then they lose. But if they run away from it, then they anger the hardcore progressives of the party. It is a no-win. Why not put your opponent in a no-win?
Now, speaking of eclectic personalities, how did you meet Michael Malice? Because I know, and I know you guys do like the shows, which is cool, which is the little cartoon shows, which I like. But how did you meet him in the first place?
I met him around 2014 because somebody, I had never heard of him before. Somebody invited or suggested that he should come on my show to talk about North Korea, where he's an expert. I had never heard of him before. And I couldn't believe that his name was actually Michael Malice. And I actually said, now let me just make sure I got like, this is not like an Italian last name. It's not like pronounced Molice or something, right? He said, no, it's Michael Malice. So anyway, we had a great episode. And then after it was over, we went off the air and just kept talking. And I said, next time I'm in New York, we ought to have lunch. So next time I was in New York, we had lunch, and it was like a motor mouth the whole time, just talk. And then before you know it, I would go up to New York quite a bit in those days. And so I would visit him, and we just realized I wouldn't say we had compatible personalities. I mean, they're compatible, but they're not the same. Nobody is like Michael Malice. I mean, honestly, there was a time when I think it was Laura Loomer had gone down to Twitter headquarters and had chained herself there in protest. And all these people gathered to chronicle this. And Michael got wind of this, and he ran down there to be part of it. And the first thing he did when he got there was to shout out, "What do you like best about me?" Like, they're all asking her questions about Twitter and censorship. And this was what. So, I mean, the thing is, I think the thing that really solidified the relationship was in 2015, he and I, you can find this on YouTube, we did a public debate on Alexander Hamilton, good guy or bad guy. And I took bad guy. Now, personally, he has a very interesting personal story, but I think his political influence was very bad. And I think he is the kind of guy who wants the elites running everything. And by the way, if I could trust these elites, that'd be one thing. If it was you and me, maybe we'd do a good job. I don't know, but not these people. Anyway, so Malice and I did this debate in New York City. It was packed. It was the biggest crowd this debate series had ever had. And it was an Oxford-style debate. So they poll the audience before the debate, where do you stand on the resolution? And then after the debate, they poll the audience again, where do you stand on the resolution? You see how many minds were changed, so you have an objective winner. And I'll tell you, I beat the shit out of it. Can I say that on this show?
Yeah, for sure. But what was the question? Was it a question that had a clear black and white, or was it a totally ambiguous?
It was. I don't remember the exact formulation, but it's on the video. So if you type Malice Woods Hamilton, it'll come up. But it was something like, the legacy. Alexander Hamilton was on net a plus for liberty. It was something like that. And so he said that he was, and I said that he wasn't. But what was fun about it was leading up to it, we had so much fun trash talking each other on Twitter on who was going to beat whom, and that I was going to have to be carried out on a stretcher because he was going to beat me so bad. Or there was a symphony orchestra. Like, I'm half Armenian. And there was a symphony orchestra that on the day of the remembrance of the Armenian genocide performed some music in recollection of the dead. Malice posts this and says, this should be a reminder of what's going to happen to Armenian Woods at this debate. I mean, it's just crazy, right? And we had so much fun. And even though he lost the debate, he didn't even care. And I even said to him, I think this was caught on tape afterward. I even said to him, there would have been no shame in losing this debate to you. It was so fun. And so we didn't even care about that. We had had an amazing experience together in front of all these people. We went out for dinner afterward. And so just ever since then, like, there have been times, I don't know why I'm saying this, maybe I'm intoxicated from the liquid death, but I've had some pretty dark moments in my life since then that are happily resolved. But there's been no one on earth I have more wanted to talk to and have help me than Michael Malice, whom I've helped him through some difficult times. He's just a good friend, even though sometimes on Twitter he can be really tough and you wonder about him, but he is an absolute sweetheart in real life, and one of these super loyal friends. So one quick thing about Michael. On that first day that I met him, he had been on Kennedy's show a lot on Fox Business, and he was apparently quite fond of her and respected her very much. And I didn't know that much about her. And I think I made some dismissive comment about her. Now, this was our first time meeting, so it would have been very easy for him to just, brush that off and, not to interfere with our developing friendship. But he politely but firmly stood up and defended her to me. And I thought, this is a guy I want as a friend, because if he'll do that for her, he'll do it for me, which indeed he has.
Yeah, I always describe him as he's a ruthless troll on social media, but only to people more powerful. And he doesn't punch down, he punches up. But he's basically soft-hearted underneath it all. A lot of people have the similar stories to you. I mean, he sees himself as a white pill guy, and that he offers the red pill, but the white pill is. I think he's writing a book called The White Pill. Actually,
He is. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
wait to read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So but yeah, fun, and I think he has popularized aspects of ideas of anarchism in ways different. Like some people got confused because they said Malice has probably done as much to popularize uh, anarchism as an idea as Lysander Spooner did in his own time and place. And
Yeah.
people were like, well, what about all these great intellectuals? I was like, oh yeah, no question, all those people exist. What I mean is he reaches ordinary, accessible, people who aren't going through academic, historical,
Right.
intellectual texts.
Right. Because, I mean, let's be honest, even though a lot of libertarians know who Lysander Spooner is, most people don't. Most people don't read him. Most people never will read him. But Malice put together a collection of these writings that a lot of people will read. And he goes on shows with big audiences and he talks about them. Now, maybe if Spooner had shaved and gotten his act together and lived in the 21st century, maybe he would have done likewise, but he didn't. Instead, we have Michael Malice.
Exactly.
I remember one of the first introduction to Michael Malice was a tweet he put out on 9/11, and I was like, holy crap, this is a notch over the limit. Like I felt dirty even reading it. I didn't retweet it or anything. He is a troll. I do remember. I don't remember where I saw the interview, but he was talking about the death of his parent, and people were treating him the way they thought, he would want to be treated, like a trollish thing, and making jokes. And it was an interesting anecdote where he said that was not what I needed the day of, but that's the nature of the beast when you live that life. But Tom, I mean, you look like, if I'm judging you based on the hour and 45 minutes we've known each other, the polar opposite of Malice. Like you don't strike me as being edgy, pushing the envelope. I mean, I guess, how does that work as a relationship, both publicly and private? More publicly than privately. Publicly, how does that work?
Okay, well, let me just say in parentheses before I forget that when I was on the Babylon Bees podcast, they said, all right, before we get started, we have some listener-supplied questions we'd like to ask you. And they were all about Michael Malice. And then I realized he fed them those questions, that jerk. He knew I was going to be on. I mean, who thinks of things like this? Who does things like this? But, here's an example. Here's a perfect example. Michael is much more adventurous than I am in a culinary sense. He'll try all kinds of exotic food. I'm just the opposite. It's not like I'm against it, but if I'm hungry, I don't want to order something I might not like, because then what am I going to do? I'm starving. So there was one time when we were going to go out to eat, and I texted him in New York. I said, doesn't matter where we eat, as long as I can recognize everything on the menu. And then he posted that on Twitter, and he said, "What?" He said that's Tom Woods in a nutshell. Because he said to me, "What does it matter if you have to recognize it? You don't have to order everything on the menu. Why?" So anyway, we ended up going to some diner. Like, he deliberately made it as vanilla as he could possibly make it in response to that. But yeah, the thing is, every once in a while, I will put out a tweet that's kind of in the Malice style, just to shock my readers. They'll say, "Oh my gosh, whoa, Woods is real. I really like spicy Woods." I get that response a lot. "I love spicy Woods," they'll say. And I basically got that entirely from Malice, from watching Malice. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's in a way, it's been good for me. I don't know if I've had some kind of influence on him, but let's just say Malice has taken me out of my comfort zone in some parts of my life, or we'll do bizarre things that I wouldn't like. I wouldn't have gone to the Museum of Modern Art, or I wouldn't have thought to go to whatever that living Shakespeare thing is that I can't remember what it's called in New York City. But we do all these oddball things that, because he's Michael Malice and he wants me to break out of my squareness. And so I've broken out of my squareness quite a bit. So I don't know, it's fun. And also, I don't know, I guess we each want we're friends in the classic Aristotelian sense of wanting what's good for the other one. We each want what's best for the other one. And I think, and he's encouraged me, he gives me good advice, but also he thinks what's good for me is not to be always the stuffed shirt that I've been through most of my life. And so that's good. That's fun for me.
Tom, tell me about Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State.
Okay. Anatomy of the State has since been released as a little kind of eeny-weeny book, but it was initially an essay in a larger book. But you can just Google Anatomy of the State, read it online. But this is one of these essays that some people say, in fact, I think it's in Malice's collection, The Anarchist Handbook. It's one of these essays that a lot of people say when they read it, it completely changed. They could never look at the world the same way again, because in that essay, Rothbard looks at the state and says, we've been taught a lot of things about the state. The state reflects our collective will, or the state activates the multiplier effect, or the state brings about the common good, or the state is just us, right? We are the state, And then he runs through and says, all right, look, every one of these is a fairy tale fantasy, and here's why. And then he says, here's what the state really is. Like the brute fact of the matter is that for all the fancy language that's used, that's draped around it, the fact of the matter is some people rule and other people are ruled. Okay, now the state wants you to believe that we are the government. And, the state loves it when on Twitter, people will criticize like a US senator and say, hey, you're supposed to be working for us. Like, oh my gosh. I mean, I know these people mean well, right? And I used to be in that position. But there is nothing about this relationship that we have with members of the state apparatus in which they are working for us, right? Their salaries are funded by confiscated funds taken from us involuntarily. That is not normally how the employer-employee relationship works. None of this, right, approximates that. But they want us to believe these fantasy stories because we're more likely to be pliable if we believe these stories about the state. But in that essay, Anatomy of the State, he tells the brutal truth. And so I don't want to spoil it for you. Go look at it.
I'm pulling it up right now. I'm going to bring up a few super chats. I don't know if these questions are mean or not. I don't know inside jokes anymore on the interwebs. Ask Tom about his being a founding member of the League of the South, which is an overtly white nationalist.
Yeah.
So sorry, this one I could have determined was intended to be mean, but I got to bring. I want to ask.
No,
the
it's
question.
fun. No, it's a lot of fun. No, the story there, which I've told, I actually have a page on my website where I respond to what my haters say. If you don't have haters, you haven't accomplished anything. This guy is one of them. That's okay. All right. It means I've done something in my life. Well, back in 1994, when I was still in college, I went to this meeting of people that said, we're going to try to form an organization that's really going to get decentralization on the map. So when I went to this meeting, nobody said, we're going to start a Southern organization. I probably wouldn't have gone because I wasn't a Southerner. I, as you know, I was born in Massachusetts, lived there, and then New York City for a long time. But I do favor decentralization. So I went. My friend Jeffrey Tucker said we should go. And at that meeting was Forrest McDonald, who's a guy who you should Google. Forrest McDonald actually won the Jefferson lecturer designation from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is the highest scholarly honor the U.S. government confers. So he was there. And so obviously this is not a group of people with white, wearing Klan outfits, right? I mean, Forrest McDonald, come on. And so at that group, it was decided, well, let's take a vote. Should we have an organization that emphasizes decentralization everywhere in the country, or should we make it a specifically Southern organization and be more precise about it? So I voted for the whole country because I wanted to do it in Massachusetts, but I lost. But I thought, well, okay, big deal. I'll still be part of it. It was not a white nationalist organization. Even the Southern Poverty Law Center, which does not concede anything, concedes this. What happened was years and years later, the guy running it went a little loco. And he said, and he says this in so many words, I decided to change the organization because we need to focus on X, Y, and Z. And so everybody left. All the PhDs who were in that room when we founded this nerdy organization in 1994 all left. And that's the end of the story. But I'm not, see, the thing is, what you're supposed to do in this situation is beat your breast and say, I'm sorry, I joined an organization that is not part of the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. Oh, Hillary Clinton, will you please forgive me? Mitt Romney, will you please take me back? I absolutely MFing refuse to do that because I didn't do anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with that organization. I would join the original version of the organization again today because they were anti-war, anti-empire, and pro-decentralization, which is what all decent people should be. And yeah, it's unfashionable, but get some stones and be willing to be unfashionable once in a while, even if it gives me grief. I could save myself so much grief if I would just say, I'm so sorry. I'm not sorry. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to reiterate that I am not sorry.
To what do you attribute? It's a common question I ask pretty much all of the guests. is your independence of thought. Like, I'm always curious whether people have even reflected on it, or what leads someone to be willing to be dissident, to say, I understand that's, because there's the easy path. The easy path is to do what's said, to go with the mainstream, to go with the establishment, not only to be in the popular clique in high school, the equivalent thereof in the modern academic, scholastic, entrepreneurial, business, financial world, whatever it may be, but just massive natural sense that a lot of people want to conform, whereas some people are willing to be independent of thought, even if it comes at the expense of popularity within certain circles of society.
No one's ever asked me this. Maybe it's a combination of my dad, when we would do the dishes together sometimes, because my mother worked at night sometimes at the restaurant. And so he would talk to me about, like, he was a cold warrior to the very end in the 1980s. And he would talk to me about the way people would make excuses for communist crimes or whatever. And I would sit there appalled, drying the dishes. Like, what? Tell me more, right? So at that point, I realized, okay, there are some people who just can't be trusted. I mean, if you couldn't get communism right, there are some people who can't be trusted. But it's not a majority of Americans who did that. So that alone wasn't enough. But he alerted me to the fact that there were some people who should have known better but didn't on issues like that. And also, he was willing to be unpopular personally, but he couldn't keep his political views to himself. That was just his way. And so I kind of respected that in a way. That he could have had an easier time, let's say, socially, if he would shut his mouth. And socially, sometimes you should shut your mouth, But the fact that he believed in something and stuck to it, even if a whole bunch of people didn't, I think that rubbed off on me. And then secondly, here's a news flash for you. When you're the nerd, sometimes the other kids don't make your life that pleasant, particularly in middle school. In high school, things got better. But in middle school, they made my life miserable. It was awful. And so I began to have a kind of, I think I may have developed subconsciously the idea that I just don't care what most people think, because most people are just asses. Like, most people are treating me miserably. I guess I don't really value their opinion on things. So I became more willing to trust myself, because I was the one I could rely on in those days. There was nobody else I could rely on. So it could have rubbed off from me there. But then once you start going down that rabbit hole and you start putting pieces together, you realize I'm right. I am right about this. And, come what may, let the world come at me. I'm not changing.
Tom, I think that might be the best way to end this, except for this. Thank you, Viva, for going the extra mile for all of us. No, I thought there were, that's not the one I want. I will. Thank you very much. But Tom, people are saying the more you talk, the more they love you. For those who never knew you before, where can people find you? I'm going to put all the pinned links in the pinned comment. Where can people find you? I know you have a number of resources, so let us have them.
Well, I would say, the principle of marketing, key principle, is give only one link, but that's so hard to do in this case. So my website, which the homepage is going to be redesigned, because it greets you with a video where I look like I'm 12. So I know that needs to be updated. But the rest of the site is updated. So tomwoods.com has everything that I do. And also, if tomspodcast.com redirects to a list of all 2,131 episodes of the Tom Woods Show, including my episode with our dear friend here, Mr. Robert Barnes. So tomspodcast.com will get you to the links, and then you can subscribe to the podcast using the links there.
Fantastic. Tom, Robert, stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone in the chat, thank you very much. Some super chats I couldn't get to, but we appreciate it, and thank you for the feedback. This was phenomenal. We'll do it. Let's do it again, because I still feel like there's another good 2 hours of discussion to be had. But
it was great. I loved it. Thank you, guys.
So stick around. We'll say our proper goodbyes. Everyone in the chat, thank you very much, and see you sooner than later.